Bang! The courtroom doors flew open. Gasps echoed through the packed room. The judge's gavel slammed down, calling for order, but the chaos had already ignited. Seated at the defense table, Angela Carter, the black woman accused of a crime she didn't commit, locked eyes with the two white cops who had framed her. Their smug faces cracked as the prosecutor's voice boomed. The defendant, Angela Carter, is a CIA agent. The courtroom erupted. The jury's eyes widened. The reporters scribbled furiously, and the cops who had set her up turned pale. Angela sat still, her face unreadable. She had played along for weeks, letting them believe she was just another innocent black woman with no power, no connections. She let them gloat, let them lie, let them forge evidence, until now. Because now, the truth was out. The judge leaned forward. Is this true? Angela didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head toward the two officers. Their hands trembled. Beads of sweat rolled down their foreheads. They had no idea who they had messed with. Before the officers could react, the prosecutor continued. Not only is she an agent, but she has evidence that will turn this entire case on its head. Dead silence. Angela reached into the folder before her. She pulled out a USB drive. This, she said calmly, is everything. The officers leaped up, shouting in protest. She's lying, one of them screamed, but it was too late. The judge turned to the bailiff. Seize them. The men started backing away as the courtroom doors slammed shut behind them. And just like that, their whole world fell apart. But how did we get here? Let's rewind. It all started 2 months ago in a quiet little town in Georgia, where Angela Carter was just another woman living her life. Or so everyone thought. Angela loved her job. By day, she worked as a school guidance counselor, helping kids find their way in a tough world. By night, she was something else entirely. A top-tier CIA agent who had spent years undercover, taking down corruption from the inside. No one knew, not even her closest friends. But then, one evening, everything changed. Angela had just finished grading some school reports when she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, 2 white police officers stood there, their expressions cold. Angela Carter? Yes? You're under arrest. Her heart didn't race. Her face didn't flinch. She simply raised an eyebrow. For what? The taller officer smirked. You know what? And just like that, they slapped the cuffs on her wrists and dragged her outside. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. She just let it happen. Because she knew something bigger was at play. Hours later, she sat in a dimly lit interrogation room. The same officers stood before her, grinning. One tossed a manila folder onto the table. Got you now. Angela opened it. Inside were photos. Fake evidence. Lies. The crime? A robbery she never committed. The victim? A store owner who had been threatened into silence. The setup? Flawless, except for one thing. Angela Carter was not the kind of woman you framed and got away with it. The officers leaned in. We know people like you. You think you're smart, but in the end, you all fall. Angela tilted her head. People like me? The shorter officer chuckled. Yeah, you know exactly what we mean. She did. She just smiled. They thought she was helpless. They thought she was just another black woman in the system. They had no idea she was trained to dismantle men like them. Angela spent the next few weeks in jail, playing the part. She listened. She observed. She gathered information. And then, she made her move. She called in a favor. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't leave a trace. Her attorney, a CIA-assigned lawyer, arrived the next day. That was step 1. Step 2? Letting the officers believe they had one. And now, here they were, standing before a judge, thinking their case was airtight. But they never saw it coming. Back in the courtroom, the moment of truth had arrived. The judge peered at Angela. What is on that drive? Angela smirked. She turned to the prosecutor. Play it. The screen lit up. Surveillance footage played. The whole room leaned in. What they saw, shocked the world. The video showed everything. The cops planting evidence, laughing about framing her, bragging about how no one would believe a black woman over them. Gasps filled the room. The officers turned ghost white. The prosecutor stood tall. Your Honor, This evidence proves that Officers Mitchell and Harris not only framed Ms. Carter, but have been doing this for years. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Angela finally leaned forward, her voice steady. Game over. The judge banged the gavel. Bailiff, arrest these men immediately. The cops lunged, trying to run, but Angela was faster. She stepped forward, blocking their escape. I wouldn't do that, she said. And the next second, bam, one of the officers swung at her. Angela dodged. The room gasped, and then she fought back. The courtroom turned into chaos. People gasped, chairs screeched, and the sound of footsteps echoed as the two officers lunged toward Angela in a desperate attempt to escape. Officer Mitchell threw the first punch. It was wild, uncoordinated, fueled by panic. Angela didn't flinch. With reflexes honed from years of CIA training, she dodged, ducking just enough to let his fist fly past her face. As his momentum carried him forward, she stepped to the side and, thwack, sent a sharp elbow into his ribs. Mitchell stumbled, gasping for air. The crowd shrieked. The bailiffs rushed forward, but Officer Harris was already on the move. He yanked out his gun. Ignoring the fact that he was in a courtroom, ignoring the judge's shouts, ignoring the madness erupting around him, he aimed right at Angela. Everything slowed. Angela could see his finger tightening on the trigger. A split-second decision. A single mistake could end everything. Then, crack. A gunshot rang out. Screams filled the air. But Angela was still standing. Harris, on the other hand, dropped his weapon, his face frozen in shock. A court security officer had fired first, hitting Harris square in the shoulder. He collapsed onto the floor, groaning in pain. Mitchell, seeing his partner go down, tried to run. He didn't make it 2 steps before Angela caught him. With one swift motion, she grabbed the back of his collar, yanked him backward, and sent him sprawling onto the floor. He let out a grunt, dazed. Angela dusted off her hands. That's enough of that. The bailiffs swarmed in, cuffing both officers as the judge banged his gavel. Order. I said order in this courtroom. Angela took a deep breath, adjusting her suit jacket. It had almost ended badly. Almost. But the truth had come out. And now, justice would be served. As the officers were dragged away, the courtroom still buzzed with shock. Reporters whispered frantically, cameras flashed, and members of the jury sat in stunned silence. Angela turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I believe my name needs to be cleared. The judge, still looking shaken, nodded. Ms. Carter, in light of the overwhelming evidence, all charges against you are hereby dropped. A weight lifted from Angela's shoulders. The sound of applause broke out, people cheering, clapping, some even standing. She didn't smile, not yet. There was still more work to do. Because if these officers had done this to her, how many others had they framed? Angela turned to the prosecutor. We need to open a full investigation into every case they handled. The prosecutor nodded. Agreed. And if we find more victims, we'll get them justice. The case was closed. But Angela knew this wasn't the end of the fight. That night, Angela sat alone in her apartment, staring at the city lights through her window. She should have been celebrating, but her mind kept going back to one thought. How many others were still out there, trapped in a system that wasn't built for them? She had been lucky. She had power, resources, training. But what about the innocent people who didn't? Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was her CIA handler. Good work, the voice on the other end said. We didn't have to step in. Angela sighed. I wasn't going to let them win. A pause. Then, we could use you on another case. We've got reports of similar setups happening in other states. Corrupt cops. Framed citizens. Angela leaned back, thinking. She had been planning to take a break. But how could she, knowing what she knew? The voice on the line continued. It's your call. But if you want in, there's a flight to Chicago tomorrow morning. Angela closed her eyes. She had just cleared her own name. Now, it was time to clear the names of others. She opened her eyes, her decision made. I'll be on that flight. The fight wasn't over yet. Not even close. And little did she know, this next mission would change everything. The plane touched down in Chicago just after midnight. The city lights stretched for miles, glowing like a sea of fireflies against the dark sky. Angela Carter stepped off the plane, a simple black duffel bag slung over her shoulder. No one looking at her would have guessed she was a highly trained CIA agent. She blended in, just another traveler moving through O'Hare International Airport. But inside, she was already calculating. Her mission was clear: expose the corrupt cops operating in the city, framing innocent people, just like Officers Mitchell and Harris had done to her. This time, she wouldn't wait for them to come for her. This time, she was going to strike first. A black sedan was waiting for her outside the airport. She slid into the back seat, shutting the door behind her. The driver, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, adjusted his rearview mirror. "Welcome to Chicago," he said, his voice steady but formal. Angela glanced at him. "I assume you're my contact?" He gave a small nod. "Name's Ryan Porter, FBI. We've been tracking these guys for months, but we needed someone to go in deep." Angela rested her arm on the door. "Tell me what you have." Ryan pulled out a folder and handed it to her. 3 officers, Detective Greg Sullivan, Officer Tom Reynolds, and Sergeant Paul DeMarco. They've been running a scheme for years, planting evidence, forcing confessions, making sure innocent people get locked away while they get paid off. Angela flipped through the pages. Mugshots, reports, victim statements. The pattern was clear. She looked up. "What's the plan?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "We need proof. Enough to make it airtight. So far, everything we have is circumstantial. People are too scared to testify." Angela smirked. "I'll get them talking." Ryan glanced at her through the mirror. "You sure? These guys are dangerous. You saw what happened in Georgia. If they get a whiff of who you really are, they won't hesitate." Angela leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "Neither will I." Ryan didn't argue. He just nodded and pulled the car into motion. By morning, Angela had a cover story. Her new identity: Vanessa Moore, a journalist investigating wrongful convictions. A nosy reporter would attract attention. She just had to make sure it was the right kind. She walked into a small coffee shop on the south side, where most of the cases tied to the corrupt officers had taken place. She ordered a black coffee and took a seat in the corner, her back against the wall, giving her a clear view of the entrance. Then, she waited. She had arranged to meet someone, a man named Marcus Hall. He had spent 5 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, thanks to Detective Sullivan and his crew. Marcus walked in 15 minutes later, scanning the room nervously. He was tall, mid-30s, with tired eyes that had seen too much. Angela raised a hand, signaling him over. He slid into the seat across from her. "You're the reporter?" Angela nodded. "I want to tell your story, Marcus. I want the world to know what they did to you." He swallowed, looking around. "I shouldn't be here." Angela leaned in. "They already took 5 years of your life. Don't let them take your voice too." Marcus hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. He placed it on the table. "This," he whispered, "is everything." Angela picked it up. "What's on it?" Marcus exhaled. "Recordings. Conversations I had with a cop who used to work with them. He wanted out, but they threatened him. He told me things that'll bury them." Angela gripped the drive tightly. This was it. But then, a shadow fell over their table. Angela looked up. 2 men stood there, wearing police uniforms. Detective Greg Sullivan and Officer Tom Reynolds. Sullivan smirked. "Funny running into you here, Marcus." Marcus froze. Reynolds cracked his knuckles. "Mind if we have a little chat?" Angela calmly took a sip of her coffee. This was the moment. She had walked straight into the lion's den, and the lions had just noticed. But what they didn't know was that she had come here to hunt them. The coffee shop went silent. Angela could feel the tension thickening around the table like a noose tightening around Marcus's neck. He was terrified, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to keep calm. Detective Greg Sullivan smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. His partner, Officer Tom Reynolds, cracked his knuckles again, as if warming up for something worse. Angela casually leaned back in her chair, still holding her coffee. She tilted her head slightly, pretending to be just another reporter caught in an awkward situation. Something I can help you with, officers? She asked, her voice light. Sullivan chuckled. Funny. I was about to ask you the same thing. His eyes flickered toward Marcus. You know, I heard you were trying to stir up some old trouble, Marcus. You know what happens to guys who can't let the past go. Angela saw Marcus shrink back, his fingers curling around his lap. Reynolds smirked. They end up in worse places than prison. Angela's grip on her coffee tightened slightly. It was a threat, a real one, and Marcus knew it. Angela placed her cup down and folded her hands on the table. Well, I'm just a reporter, and Mr. Hall here is telling me his story. You wouldn't happen to have a problem with that, would you? Sullivan's smile faded slightly. See, here's the thing, miss. Angela didn't blink. Vanessa Moore. Sullivan nodded slowly. Miss Moore, there are some things you don't want to get yourself involved in. Some stories don't need telling. You understand me? Angela held his gaze. Oh, I understand. She saw the momentary flicker of unease in his eyes. Sullivan was used to people cowering, backing down, but she wasn't afraid. He didn't know why, but something about her made him cautious. Angela turned to Marcus. I think our conversation is over for today. Let's go. Marcus hesitated. Sullivan took a step closer, lowering his voice. Not so fast. Angela sighed. She had given them a chance to walk away. They didn't take it. Without warning, she kicked the table forward, slamming it into Sullivan's stomach. He stumbled back with a grunt. Before Reynolds could react, Angela was already on her feet, gripping his wrist and twisting it sharply. Crack. His gun dropped to the floor. The entire coffee shop gasped. Marcus jumped up, frozen in shock. Sullivan regained his footing, his hand reaching for his own weapon. Angela moved faster. She spun, sweeping his legs out from under him. He crashed onto the floor, his head hitting the tile with a hard thud. By the time he groaned and tried to push himself up, Angela was already grabbing Marcus's wrist. Move, she ordered. Marcus didn't hesitate. They bolted for the door, pushing through stunned customers as shouts erupted behind them. Stop them, Reynolds bellowed. Angela shoved the glass door open, dragging Marcus onto the busy sidewalk. We need to go, he gasped. Angela scanned the street. A black sedan was parked across the road. Ryan Porter was behind the wheel, waiting. Perfect timing. She yanked Marcus toward the car as sirens blared in the distance. Ryan threw the door open. Get in. Angela shoved Marcus into the back seat and jumped in after him. The car peeled away from the curb just as Sullivan and Reynolds stumbled out of the cafe, shouting into their radios. They were furious. And now, they knew. Angela wasn't just some reporter. She was something else. Something dangerous. And they weren't going to stop until they found out exactly who she was. As the car sped down the Chicago streets, Marcus sat back, breathing hard. Who the hell are you? Angela glanced at him, her face calm. I'm the person who's going to take them down. And she meant it. Because now, this wasn't just a case. It was war. The city lights blurred past as Ryan Porter sped through Chicago's streets, gripping the wheel like a man on a mission. In the back seat, Marcus was still catching his breath, his hands shaking from the encounter at the coffee shop. Angela Carter, however, was completely calm. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment the enemy realized she was a threat. Now, Sullivan and Reynolds would come after her. They would dig. They would ask questions. They would try to find out who Vanessa Moore really was. And they would fail. Because Vanessa Moore didn't exist. Angela turned to Ryan. We need a secure place. Somewhere off the grid. Ryan nodded. I have a safe house on the west side. No cameras. No records. We'll be ghosts. Angela glanced at Marcus. You good? He swallowed hard. I've never seen anyone do what you just did. You took them down like it was nothing. Angela studied him for a moment. He had spent 5 years in prison because of men like Sullivan and Reynolds. He had suffered. But he wasn't weak. He was just afraid. They took your life from you, Angela said quietly. Now it's time to take theirs. Marcus exhaled sharply, nodding. The safe house was a nondescript brick building in an abandoned part of town. Ryan parked the car in an alleyway, leading them inside through a side door. The place was simple, one small room with a couch, a table, and a laptop. A dim overhead light buzzed softly. Ryan locked the door behind them. We should be safe here for now. Angela sat down at the table and pulled out the flash drive Marcus had given her. She plugged it into the laptop. The screen flickered to life. Folders. Files. Audio recordings. Angela clicked on the first one. A deep, nervous voice played through the speakers. Man, I'm telling you, Sullivan and Reynolds, they ain't just dirty. They're killers. You cross him, you disappear. Angela exchanged a glance with Ryan. The voice continued. They frame people, set him up, get paid by the gangs and the politicians to put the right people behind bars and keep the wrong ones free. And if you try to stop him, they make sure you regret it. Marcus swallowed hard. That was Officer Dwayne Carter. He was a cop, but he wanted out. He told me everything. Then, one day, he just vanished. Angela clicked on another file. A different recording played. This time, it was Sullivan's voice. Paul ain't gonna be a problem. We did 5 years on him already. He knows better than to run his mouth. Marcus clenched his fists. They thought they broke me. Angela clicked on another file. What about Carter? Reynolds' voice. Dwayne? He was stupid. Tried to turn evidence in. Had to handle him. Angela felt a cold anger settle in her chest. Ryan muttered. They killed their own guy. Angela closed the laptop. This is enough to destroy them. Marcus nodded. But if we try to take this to the police, they'll bury it. We need a bigger move. Angela's eyes darkened. Then we take it public. Ryan raised an eyebrow. How public are we talking? Angela leaned forward. We make sure the whole world sees this before they even have a chance to shut it down. Marcus frowned. How do we do that? Angela's lips curled into a small smile. I know a guy. The next morning, Angela sat across from an old friend. Malcolm Harris. Investigative journalist. One of the best in the country. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk. You always did bring me the craziest stories. Angela slid the flash drive across the table. This one is different. This one's real. Malcolm picked it up, spinning it between his fingers. And you want me to break it? Angela nodded. You're the only one I trust. Malcolm smirked. That's because I'm the only one crazy enough to publish this. He inserted the drive into his computer. As he listened to the recordings, his smirk disappeared. His face hardened. This is big, he muttered. Real big. Angela leaned forward. Then let's make sure it's bigger. We need to release it all at once. News outlets, social media, everything. The moment it drops, Sullivan and Reynolds won't be able to spin it. Malcolm nodded slowly. I can do that. But you know this means war, right? Angela's expression didn't change. It already was. That night, Angela, Marcus, and Ryan sat in the safe house, watching the news. The story had broken. The headlines flashed across the screen. Corrupt Chicago cops exposed. Secret recordings reveal years of wrongful convictions. Police officers linked to murders, false arrests, and gang deals. FBI launches investigation. The city was on fire. And somewhere in the chaos, Sullivan and Reynolds were watching their world burn. Angela took a slow breath. This was it. The final battle was coming. But just as she started to relax, Ryan's phone buzzed. He answered, listening for a few seconds before his expression changed. What is it? Angela asked. Ryan hesitated. Then, he looked at her. Sullivan and Reynolds are gone. Angela's stomach tightened. What do you mean gone? Ryan's face was grim. I mean they vanished. No one knows where they are. Angela's pulse quickened. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. Angela's mind sharpened like a blade. The news that Sullivan and Reynolds had disappeared sent a chill through her. Vanished? That wasn't possible. Corrupt cops like them didn't just run. They had a plan. She turned to Ryan. When did they go missing? Last sighting was 5 hours ago, Ryan said, still gripping his phone. After the news broke, there was a scramble at the precinct. Then, nothing. They haven't checked in. Their homes are empty. Phones disconnected. Angela's jaw clenched. They knew this was coming. Marcus, sitting in the corner, ran a hand over his face. So what now? They're gonna disappear and get away with it? Angela shook her head. No. We flushed them out, and now they're desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. Ryan exhaled. I'll put feelers out, see if anyone's heard anything. Angela looked at Marcus. You're staying here. No arguments. Marcus frowned. You think they'll come after me? Angela nodded. They know you're involved. If they're planning something, you're a target. Marcus swallowed hard but didn't argue. Angela grabbed her phone and stood up. She was going hunting. Angela's first stop was an old contact, Dante Bones Lewis. Dante wasn't a cop, but he knew the underbelly of Chicago better than anyone. If Sullivan and Reynolds had help escaping, Dante would hear about it. She met him in the back of a dimly lit nightclub on the south side. Dante sat in a leather chair, a gold watch glinting on his wrist as he eyed Angela with a smirk. Well, if it ain't the ghost herself. Angela took a seat across from him. I need information. Dante chuckled. You always do. He sipped his drink. What's in it for me? Angela slid an envelope across the table. Dante peeked inside. Cash. A lot of it. He raised an eyebrow. You always pay well. I like that. Angela leaned in. Sullivan and Reynolds. Where are they? Dante's smirk faded. He glanced around before lowering his voice. Those two? They went underground fast. Someone's protecting them. Angela's eyes narrowed. Who? Dante hesitated. Angela tapped the table. Bones, don't play with me. Dante exhaled. Word is they're with him. Angela stiffened. Who? Dante locked eyes with her. Chief Daniels. Angela's blood turned ice cold. Chief Patrick Daniels. Chicago's chief of police. The man who ran the entire department. And if he was protecting Sullivan and Reynolds, then this went all the way to the top. Angela stood. Thanks for the tip. Dante shook his head. Be careful, Carter. You just poked a bear. Angela gave a small smirk. Good. Then, she walked out into the night. Because now she had a new mission. Not just taking down Sullivan and Reynolds. Taking down the entire corrupt system protecting them. Back at the safe house, Ryan was already waiting. Angela shut the door behind her. We have a problem. Ryan rubbed his temples. Let me guess. Chief Daniels. Angela nodded. He's hiding them. Ryan cursed under his breath. That explains how they vanished so fast. Daniels must have had them pulled before the feds could move in. Angela crossed her arms. We need proof. If we can link him to them, we can bring him down. Ryan thought for a second. Then, his eyes lit up. Wait, what if we bait him? Angela raised an eyebrow. Go on. Ryan smirked. We leak a false lead. Make it look like Sullivan and Reynolds turned on him. If Daniels panics, he'll make a move. Maybe try to silence them for good. Angela's lips curled into a dangerous smile. I like the way you think. Ryan nodded. I'll handle the leak. You? Angela cracked her knuckles. I'll be watching Daniels. Because now, the hunt had truly begun. Angela sat in the dimly lit safe house, her fingers drumming against the table. Ryan had just planted the false lead. Word was spreading that Sullivan and Reynolds were willing to cut a deal, offering up everything in exchange for immunity. Now, all they had to do was wait. Chief Daniels wouldn't take the risk. If Sullivan and Reynolds really turned on him, his entire empire would crumble. And men like Daniels didn't crumble. They crushed. Ryan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then smirked. It's working. Police radio chatter just spiked. Someone's putting pressure on the search for Sullivan and Reynolds. Angela nodded. Daniels is moving. Marcus, sitting nearby, looked uneasy. You really think he'll go after his own guys? Angela turned to him. Daniels isn't protecting them because he cares. He's protecting them because they know too much. The moment they become a threat, he'll erase them. Marcus shuddered. Cold. Ryan leaned forward. So what's the plan? We let him make a move, then what? Angela's eyes gleamed. We follow him. 2 hours later, they were sitting in an unmarked van across from an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. Angela had chosen the spot carefully. Ryan had leaked the false lead through a contact, claiming Sullivan and Reynolds were hiding here, waiting for an FBI escort to take them to protective custody. Now, they just had to see who showed up. The van was silent. Ryan watched the warehouse through binoculars. Marcus sat in the back, anxious but determined. Angela sat perfectly still, waiting. Then, headlights appeared in the distance. A black SUV. Then another. Angela's grip tightened on the wheel. Ryan murmured, "Here we go." The SUVs rolled to a stop. Doors opened. Angela adjusted her own binoculars. Chief Daniels stepped out first, wearing a long black coat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the confidence of a man who controlled everything. Behind him were 4 men, heavily armed, no badges in sight. This wasn't an official police operation. This was a hit. Angela's pulse remained steady. "Told you." Ryan exhaled. "Damn." Marcus clenched his fists. "They're going to kill them." Angela watched closely. Daniels was barking orders, his men spreading out toward the warehouse. Sullivan and Reynolds weren't even inside. But Daniels didn't know that. He was about to walk into a trap. Angela turned to Ryan. "Let's make sure they don't leave." They moved fast. Angela slipped out of the van, staying in the shadows. Ryan followed, while Marcus stayed behind, watching through a camera feed. The warehouse had 2 exits, the front and the back. Angela took the back. Ryan covered the front. The plan was simple. Get proof that Daniels had come to kill Sullivan and Reynolds. Then, shut him down. Angela crouched near a stack of crates, listening. Inside, she could hear Daniels' men tearing the place apart. One of them cursed. "They ain't here." Daniels' voice was sharp. "Then find them." Angela pulled out her phone, recording. This was the evidence they needed. Proof that Daniels was ordering a hit. She just needed a little more. Then, a gun cocked behind her. "Put your hands up." Angela froze. Slowly, she turned. One of Daniels' men stood there, aiming a silenced pistol at her chest. His expression was blank, cold. He wasn't going to ask questions. He was going to shoot. Angela sighed. She hated when they made it too easy. She moved before he could blink. Her left hand shot forward, slamming his wrist to the side just as he pulled the trigger. The silencer muffled the shot, the bullet burying itself harmlessly into a crate. Angela twisted his arm, flipping him forward onto the ground. Before he could recover, she struck. An elbow to the back of his head. He crumpled. Angela exhaled. "Amateur." She turned back toward the warehouse. Time to end this. Inside, Daniels was growing impatient. They said they were here. Where are they? Angela stepped through the back door, silent as a shadow. Ryan was already in position, covering the other side. Angela's voice rang out. "They were never here, Daniels." The room froze. Daniels spun, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell?" Then, recognition dawned. "You." Angela smirked. "Me." His men immediately raised their weapons. Angela lifted her phone, showing the recording. This is you. Ordering a hit on your own officers. This goes out to the right people, and your whole career is over." Daniel's face twisted with rage. "Kill her." The room erupted. Gunfire exploded. Angela dove behind a crate as bullets ripped through the air. Ryan returned fire from the other side, keeping them pinned. Marcus' voice came through the earpiece. "Angela, SWAT's on the way. 5 minutes." Not fast enough. Angela pulled out her sidearm. She only needed 1 shot. Daniels ducked behind a metal beam, shouting orders. Angela took a deep breath. Then, she moved. She rolled from cover, raised her weapon, and fired. Bang! The bullet slammed into Daniel's shoulder. He roared in pain, dropping his gun. His men panicked. Some ran. Some surrendered. Angela strode forward, kicking Daniel's gun away. He glared up at her, gasping. You don't know what you just did." Angela knelt beside him, her voice ice cold. "No, you don't." Outside, sirens wailed. The war was over. Angela had one. The sirens screamed through the night as blue and red lights flooded the warehouse. Police SUVs skidded to a stop, doors flying open as a swarm of SWAT officers rushed in, their rifles raised. Angela didn't move. She stood over Chief Daniels, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder, gasping for breath. His men were either on the ground, surrendering, or had fled into the shadows. Ryan lowered his weapon as SWAT stormed in, hands in the air. "Now." Angela calmly raised her hands, her face unreadable. The lead SWAT officer, Captain James Holloway, stepped forward, his sharp eyes darting between her, Daniels, and the wreckage of the shootout. What the hell happened here? Angela smirked. Just cleaning up corruption. Daniels groaned from the floor, blood dripping between his fingers. His face twisted in rage as he looked up at Holloway. Arrest her. She's the criminal here. Angela arched an eyebrow. Really? Because I have a recording that says otherwise. She pulled out her phone, pressing play. Daniel's own voice filled the warehouse. Kill her. The SWAT officers froze. Some exchanged glances. Holloway's expression darkened. He turned to his men. Cuff him. Daniel's face drained of color. What? No. You listen to me. I run this city. Holloway didn't blink. Not anymore. One of the officers yanked Daniels up, twisting his arms behind his back. As they dragged him toward the squad car, his voice turned into a desperate snarl. This isn't over. You hear me, Carter? This isn't over. Angela watched him go, her expression calm. Oh, it is, she murmured. Ryan stepped beside her. You sure about that? Angela exhaled. No. Men like Daniels didn't go down without a fight. This wasn't over. Not yet. 2 hours later, Angela, Ryan, and Marcus were back at the safe house. The news was already spreading. Chicago police chief arrested in corruption scandal. Secret recordings reveal years of cover-ups and crimes. Public calls for police reform after explosive investigation. Angela sat on the couch, her arms crossed. Marcus paced the room. Daniels is in custody. Sullivan and Reynolds are missing. What happens now? Ryan ran a hand through his hair. The department's in chaos. Some cops are scrambling to distance themselves. Others are probably still loyal to Daniels. We don't know how deep this goes. Angela nodded. Then we stay sharp. Marcus hesitated. You really think Sullivan and Reynolds will come back? Angela didn't answer, because deep down, she knew the truth. They weren't running. They were waiting. And when they came back, they wouldn't come alone. The next morning, Angela's prediction came true. A knock sounded at the door. Ryan stiffened, pulling his gun. Angela motioned for him to stay back. She opened the door, just an inch. Outside stood Malcolm Harris, her journalist friend. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. Angela's stomach dropped. Malcolm swallowed hard. You need to see this. He handed her a phone. Angela took it and pressed play. A grainy video loaded. At first, it was just static. Then, a man's voice. Deep, gruff, familiar. Angela Carter, you took something from me. Now I'm taking something from you. Angela's blood turned to ice. The camera panned to a dimly lit room. A chair. A man tied up, beaten, blood dripping down his face. Marcus leaned in, squinting. Wait, is that? Angela's jaw clenched. It was Dante Bones Lewis, her contact, the man who gave her Daniel's name. He was barely conscious, his head slumped forward. Then, the voice spoke again. This is just the beginning. The screen went black. Angela gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. Marcus stepped back. That was Sullivan or Reynolds? Angela's eyes darkened. No, she whispered. This is someone worse. Ryan exhaled sharply. Then we need to find him before it's too late. Angela's mind was already racing. She knew what this was. A message. A challenge. Sullivan and Reynolds weren't just hiding. They had help. And whoever they were working with was coming for her. The room was dead silent. Angela stared at the black screen, her mind working like a machine. The message was clear. Sullivan and Reynolds had found reinforcements. Someone powerful. Someone brutal. And now, they were making their move. Ryan was already dialing numbers, trying to trace the video. Marcus paced the room, his hands running through his hair. We have to do something, he muttered. They'll kill him, Angela. Angela snapped back into focus. They won't. Not yet. Marcus looked at her. How do you know? Angela's expression hardened. Because that video wasn't a warning. It was bait. Marcus frowned. Bait? Ryan looked up from his phone. She's right. They don't just want to hurt Dante. They want her to come after him. Marcus exhaled sharply. And you're still going, aren't you? Angela didn't hesitate. Yes. Ryan sighed, running a hand down his face. Then we need a plan. Angela turned back to Malcolm. Where did this come from? Malcolm swallowed. An anonymous email. No trace. Angela's jaw clenched. Whoever they were dealing with was smart, which meant they were dangerous. Ryan stood. We need to figure out where they're keeping Dante. Angela's mind raced. They wouldn't take him to a police station, not with Daniels behind bars. They need somewhere off the books, somewhere they control. Ryan's eyes narrowed. Then we start with the people who are still loyal to Daniels. Someone has to know. Angela nodded, and she had just the person in mind. An hour later, Angela was sitting across from Sergeant Mike Delaney. He was a mid-level officer, dirty enough to have worked under Daniels, but smart enough to stay off the radar. Right now, he was handcuffed to a chair in a dimly lit warehouse, sweat rolling down his forehead. Angela leaned forward. Where are they keeping Dante? Delaney scoffed. I don't know what you're talking about. Angela sighed. I don't have time for this. She pulled out her phone and pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room. Kill her. Delaney's face paled. Angela tilted her head. See, your boss is done. Sullivan and Reynolds? They're next. But you? You still have a way out. Delaney swallowed hard. I don't know, okay? I just know they moved him somewhere outside the city. A safe house. They're meeting with someone tonight. Angela's gaze sharpened. Who? Delaney hesitated. Angela grabbed his wrist and squeezed hard. Delaney let out a choked gasp. All right. His name is Victor Navarro. Angela's grip tightened. Navarro. She knew that name. Ex-military. Mercenary. A ghost in the underworld. If Sullivan and Reynolds had teamed up with him, this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was war. Angela and Ryan drove fast. The safe house was an abandoned motel an hour outside of Chicago. Isolated. No backup nearby. Perfect for an execution. Ryan parked down the road. We're going in quiet. Angela nodded. She checked her weapon. Then, they moved. The night was thick with tension. The motel was dark, a single dim light flickering near the entrance. Angela spotted 2 guards near the front door. Armed. She turned to Ryan. We take them out fast. Ryan smirked. Thought you'd never asked. They split up. Angela moved like a shadow, creeping up behind the first guard. Before he could react, she had her arm around his throat. He struggled, gasped, then went limp. Ryan handled the second with a silenced shot to the leg, dropping him before knocking him unconscious. Angela grabbed the keys from one of their belts. They were inside. The motel smelled like damp carpet and sweat. Angela moved down the hallway, her gun raised. A muffled groan came from one of the rooms. Dante. Angela reached the door. Locked. She stepped back and, kick. The door flew open. Inside, Dante was tied to a chair, his face battered. Across from him, Victor Navarro. The mercenary turned, his cold eyes meeting Angela's. He smirked. You're just in time. Angela raised her gun. Let him go. Navarro chuckled. You don't give orders here, Agent Carter. Angela didn't flinch. Then let me make it clear. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Then, Sullivan and Reynolds stepped out of the shadows. Guns drawn. Angela's pulse remained steady. Sullivan sneered. Surprised? Angela tilted her head. Not even a little. Reynolds smirked. Then you should have known this was a trap. Angela's expression didn't change. Oh, I did. Then, a gunshot. But it wasn't from her. Navarro fired first. Straight at Dante. Angela's heart stopped. Dante let out a choked sound, his body jerking, and then he went still. Angela's world slowed. Sullivan laughed. Oops. Angela's grip tightened on her gun. She was about to kill them all. But before she could, the lights exploded. The room was thrown into darkness. Shouts. Footsteps. Chaos. Angela felt a hand grab her wrist. Ryan. Move, he hissed. They bolted. Bullets tore through the air as they sprinted out the back door. Angela didn't stop. Not until they were back in the car, speeding down the highway. Her chest heaved. Her hands clenched into fists. Dante was dead. And now, so were they. The car sped down the empty highway, tires screeching as Ryan gripped the wheel, pushing the engine harder than it should have been pushed. The city lights were still far away, but Angela barely noticed them. Her mind was consumed with one thing. Dante was dead. She had failed. And now, Sullivan, Reynolds, and Navarro were still breathing. Marcus was silent in the back seat, his face pale. He hadn't spoken since they ran. Ryan finally glanced at Angela. "You okay?" Angela's jaw was tight.
No.
Ryan sighed, refocusing on the road.
We knew this was dangerous.
Angela's fingers curled into fists. "Yeah, but I didn't think they'd kill him just to send a message." Marcus finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "What do we do now?" Angela took a slow breath. "We end this." Marcus frowned. "How?" "We just walked into a trap, and they got away again." Angela turned to him, her eyes dark. "They won't get away this time." Ryan gave her a side glance. "You got a plan?" Angela nodded. "We take Navarro out first." Ryan arched an eyebrow. "Not Sullivan or Reynolds?" Angela shook her head. "No. Sullivan and Reynolds are just corrupt cops. Navarro is the real problem. He's the one keeping them alive. Without him, they're nothing." Ryan considered it. "All right. And how do we find Navarro?" Angela exhaled.
We make him come to us.
By the next night, Angela's trap was already set. The plan was simple. Navarro didn't care about Sullivan and Reynolds. He was only working with them because they were useful. But Angela knew how mercenaries thought. They were only loyal to money. So she was going to buy him out. Angela sat alone in a darkened warehouse, a single dim bulb flickering above her. A burner phone sat in front of her, ringing. She answered on the second ring. Navarro's voice was deep, amused. "You're bold, Carter."
Calling me after what happened.
Angela's voice was steady. "I have a deal for you." Navarro chuckled. "Oh, this should be good." Angela leaned forward. "Sullivan and Reynolds. They're deadweight. Cut them loose, and I'll pay you double whatever they promised." A pause. Then, Navarro laughed. "You really think you can buy me?" Angela smirked. "I think you like money more than you like them." Navarro hummed. "Maybe, but there's a problem." Angela waited. Then Navarro's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "I don't need your money." Angela's stomach clenched. Then, gunfire. Loud. Explosive. Outside the warehouse. Ryan's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Angela, they're here." Angela's blood ran cold. Navarro hadn't fallen for the bait. She had. And now, she was trapped. The warehouse erupted in chaos. Bullets tore through crates, sending splinters flying. Angela dove behind cover, pulling her gun. Ryan and Marcus were outside, pinned down behind their car. Navarro's men had surrounded them. Angela gritted her teeth. She had underestimated him. She wouldn't make that mistake again. She peeked around the crate, spotting Navarro standing near the entrance. He wasn't even hiding. He was watching, a satisfied smirk on his face. Angela exhaled sharply. Fine. If Navarro wanted a war, she'd give him one. She aimed and fired. The bullet grazed Navarro's arm. He grunted, stumbling back. The smirk vanished. Angela sprinted toward the exit, weaving between gunfire. She needed to get to Ryan and Marcus. Navarro's voice echoed through the warehouse. "Kill her." Angela didn't slow. She reached the door just as a bullet whizzed past her ear. She dove outside, rolling behind a stack of metal barrels. Ryan was already firing back. "Nice of you to join us," he shouted. Angela ignored him, scanning the battlefield. Then, she spotted them. Sullivan and Reynolds. They were slipping away. Angela cursed. "Ryan, hold them off. I'm going after Sullivan and Reynolds." Ryan barely had time to nod before Angela was already moving. She sprinted through the back alley, gun in hand. Up ahead, Sullivan and Reynolds were shoving through a chain-link fence. Angela pushed harder. She wasn't letting them escape again. She climbed the fence in seconds, dropping down on the other side. Sullivan turned, eyes wide. "You've got to be kidding me." Angela smirked. "Miss me?" Reynolds pulled his gun. Angela didn't stop moving. She grabbed his wrist, twisting hard. The gun clattered to the ground. Sullivan lunged. Angela sidestepped, slamming an elbow into his ribs. He gasped, stumbling back. Reynolds tried to punch her. She ducked. Then, crack. She drove her fist into his jaw. Reynolds hit the pavement. Hard. Sullivan groaned, clutching his ribs. You don't get it, do you? Angela stood over them, breathing hard. Oh, I get it. She pointed her gun at Sullivan's head.
I just don't care.
Sullivan swallowed hard. Angela's finger hovered over the trigger. Then, a low voice. Carter. Angela froze. Navarro stood at the end of the alley, gun raised. Angela didn't move. Sullivan and Reynolds scrambled away. Angela's heart pounded. Navarro smirked. You should have taken the deal. Then, he pulled the trigger. Angela dove. But the bullet slammed into her shoulder. Pain exploded through her body. She hit the ground, gasping. Navarro stepped closer, gun still aimed. Angela clenched her teeth. She was out of time, out of moves. And for the first time, she might not make it out. Angela lay on the cold pavement, her breath ragged, pain searing through her shoulder. Blood oozed down her arm, staining her clothes. Navarro stood over her, his gun still trained on her head. He smirked. You know, Carter, I have to admit, I thought you'd last longer. Angela clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay conscious. She couldn't let it end like this. Not here. Not now. Footsteps echoed behind Navarro. Sullivan and Reynolds had recovered, limping toward him, their faces bruised but triumphant. Sullivan grinned. This is how it ends, Carter. You lost. Angela forced a weak smirk. You sure about that? Sullivan rolled his eyes. Spare me the hero talk. You're done. Navarro chuckled. Let's get this over with. He took a step closer, pressing the barrel of his gun against Angela's forehead. Angela's heart pounded. Then, a sharp whistle cut through the night. Navarro frowned. What the? Then, boom. An explosion erupted behind them. Fire burst into the sky as a car detonated in flames. Navarro and his men spun around in shock. Angela moved. With everything she had left, she kicked Navarro's legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, his gun skidding away. Sullivan shouted, reaching for his weapon. Bang! A shot rang out. Sullivan staggered backward, clutching his leg. Ryan stepped out from the shadows, gun smoking. Sorry I'm late, he said. Angela rolled onto her knees, gripping her wounded shoulder. Took you long enough. Marcus ran up behind Ryan, holding a crowbar. We got worried. Navarro groaned on the ground, reaching for his backup gun. Angela didn't give him the chance. She lunged forward, slamming her boot into his wrist. The gun clattered away. Navarro hissed in pain, glaring up at her. You really think this ends with me? Angela grabbed him by the collar, yanking him up. No, she said coldly. Then she punched him. Hard. Navarro's head snapped back, and he collapsed, unconscious. Angela exhaled heavily, her body screaming in pain. Ryan stepped forward, securing Navarro with zip ties. Marcus looked at the crumpled forms of Sullivan and Reynolds. What about them? Angela wiped blood from her lip. We hand them over. Ryan raised an eyebrow. You sure? After everything they did? Angela stared at the two corrupt cops. She had wanted to kill them, but that wasn't who she was. No, she said finally. They don't deserve an easy way out. They'll rot in a cell for the rest of their lives. Marcus smirked. I like that. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Angela let out a slow breath. It was over. Finally. 24 hours later. The city was on fire with the news. Ex-police chief Patrick Daniels facing life in prison for corruption and murder. Officers Sullivan and Reynolds exposed, tied to years of false convictions. Mercenary Victor Navarro in custody. Connections to multiple crimes across the country. Angela sat in a hospital bed, her shoulder wrapped in bandages. Ryan stood at the window, scrolling through his phone. You're a celebrity now. Angela groaned. Great. Marcus walked in, holding a cup of coffee. You did it, Carter. Angela exhaled. We did it. Ryan smirked. So, what now? Angela looked at the TV screen, where footage of Navarro being dragged into a courtroom played. Then she smiled. Now? We rest. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. It never was. And when the next battle came, she'd be ready. The sun set over Chicago, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. The city was still reeling from the storm Angela had unleashed. News anchors spoke her name in hushed awe, reporters scrambled for interviews, and corrupt officers who had once walked with impunity now sat in interrogation rooms, their lies unraveling one by one. Justice had come like a tidal wave. But Angela Carter wasn't celebrating. She sat alone on a quiet rooftop, overlooking the skyline. A cold breeze brushed against her bandaged shoulder, a reminder of how close she had come to not making it out. She had won. But victory never felt as sweet as people thought it would. She heard footsteps behind her. "Ryan, you're supposed to be resting," he said, leaning against the railing. Angela smirked. "I don't do rest very well." Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I figured." They stood in silence for a while, watching the city. Then Ryan spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You think this is really over?" Angela's smirk faded. She thought about Daniels rotting in a prison cell, about Sullivan and Reynolds stripped of their badges, about Navarro, one of the most dangerous men she'd ever faced, now sitting in FBI custody. It was over, but only for now. "There's always another fight," she murmured. Ryan studied her. "And you're always going to be the one to fight it? Huh?" Angela exhaled. "Someone has to." Ryan shook his head. "You ever think about walking away? Just living a normal life?" Angela thought about that. A normal life. No more late-night chases. No more shootouts. No more corruption to expose. But could she really leave it all behind? She had been fighting her entire life, for justice, for the truth, for the people who had no voice. It was in her blood. And deep down, she knew there would always be another case, another victim, another battle waiting in the shadows. She turned to Ryan, a small smile playing at her lips. "Maybe one day." Ryan smirked. "I'll believe it when I see it." Angela laughed softly, shaking her head. Then, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. No name, no number, just a message. "We need to talk." Angela stared at it for a moment. Then, she tucked the phone into her pocket, exhaling. Yeah, it was never really over. She turned back to the skyline, feeling the weight of the city on her shoulders. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready for whatever came next.